The purpose of government was to protect liberty. It wasn't there to regulate our lives. It wasn't there to police the world. It wasn't there to tell everybody how to spend their money and what they have to take into their bodies. The Constitution, if you read it carefully, it's so clear. It has nothing to do with restraining peaceful activity of individuals. Nothing. It's essentially a document written for the purpose of limiting the government. That is what it's for.
Absolutely, and a little more honoring of the Constitution. This is Janice Arnold-Jones. I am sitting in for Adam Kokesh. This is Adam versus the Man, and it's a privilege to be here. We have been talking about some of the election processes, and I have been lamenting that many of the candidates that are going to be elected on Tuesday have yet to ever address some of the real problems that we're facing. And since I have time to talk about it, I'm going to talk one more time about our election season in the state of New Mexico. Now, some of you who are hearing this do not have an election season. We have an election season. Our election season runs 28 days. In the primary election in Bernalillo County alone, it cost $80 per ballot because we have an election season paid for, borne by the voters. And I thought, I am the only one who is unhappy about this, and I'm making an economic argument, although I will make the argument that if you vote a month before the election, which is November 2nd, you might miss some very important information. But my friend Kim Hillard found a wonderful piece written by Linda Chavez about not voting early. And it was so good, I'm going to share it with you now. And this is Linda Chavez. And Linda Chavez, and I should just quickly tell you where she's from. She is the chairman of the Center for Equal Opportunity and the author of Betrayal, How Union Bosses Shake Down Their Members and Corrupt American Politics. So Linda says, nearly 1 in 4 voters will have cast their ballot before Election Day, but I won't be one of them. Nothing but grave illness could keep me from the polls on November 2nd. I've never missed voting in the general election since 1968, and in all those years, I voted absentee only once when my job took me out of town on Election Day. If I sound a bit self-righteous on the subject, it's because I am. I don't believe that the trend toward early voting, embraced by both Republicans and Democrats, is a good thing. It eliminates an important public exercise of civic duty, one that helps build a sense of community and responsibility. Election Day is the only time citizens come together in their communities in one place at one time to engage in an important civic activity. When I go to the polls on Tuesday, I will see my neighbors, meet political volunteers, and judge for myself how well election officials are handling their duties. Since this is a non-presidential year, the lines probably won't be long at my polling place.
For the last year and a half, the Tea Party movement has rallied Americans around the cause of bringing fiscal responsibility.
I would say we're right back here. Hillsborough Elementary School in Loudoun County, Virginia. But I've stood in plenty of lines at the polling place in other years and other places. It's not always convenient or comfortable, especially during inclement weather, but I've always believed that the least I could do as an American is to show up and vote. There's something special about entering the polling booth, even though curtains are now gone, as is the old lever you used to pull to mark your ballot. Now there are computer screens, but not in New Mexico. We have paper ballots, but that's another story, that make it seem more like visiting an ATM. But no matter what the technology, there's still that important moment of truth when you make a decision that really matters. There have been times when I found the decision difficult, like the first time I voted for a Republican, Ronald Reagan, or cast a vote for someone I thought was simply the lesser of two unappealing candidates. But at least I could rest assured when I cast my vote that everyone else there on that day had access to the same information on the candidate as I did, even if they didn't avail themselves of it. But that isn't the case when voters cast their ballots
over several days or even weeks. Much can happen in the waning days of an election, especially in tight races. New information about a candidate can come to light. A candidate may do or say something foolish or desperate, which casts doubts on his or her character. Some outside event can alter the stakes in an election, but if you've already cast your ballot, you won't be able to take this information into account. In this election alone, I've seen Alaska Republican Senate nominee Joe Miller admit this week that he lied to federal investigators about his use of government computers for political purposes. The admission has made it far more likely that the incumbent, Senator Lisa Murkowski, who lost the Republican primary to Miller and is running as a write-in candidate, may win the election. But Alaska is one of 32 states in the District of Columbia that allows early voting. So Alaskans who've already voted will not have the opportunity to weigh this new information. The major argument in favor of early voting was that the added convenience would encourage more Americans to vote. The United States has notoriously poor voter participation. Only 62% of eligible voters turned out in 2008 and even fewer in 2006, about 40%. And in New Mexico, as we have done early voting, our percentage of increase is absolutely zero. The availability of early voting in many states has done little to improve voter participation, which is still lower than they were in the early 60s when voter registration laws were tighter and absentee ballots were more difficult to attain. Those who tend to vote early are the very people who would vote on Election Day, namely older voters. Choosing our elected officials is the most important thing we do as Americans. Is it really too much to ask that we set aside a few minutes every 2 years to go to the polls and ask for our vote? Early voting. So, I'll take a poll here in the room. Kim, you've been a presiding judge. Mike, you are actually at the polls.
Correct.
And so was there a lot of activity today in early voting?
I was working at the warehouse today, so I wasn't at any of the polls, but I have worked the polls this week, primarily in the South Valley, and the activity has been moderate to light, at least in the polling locations that I have been challenging.
Wow.
The one that my wife went to today, it actually was filling up with the lines going outside the door. So there were more people wanting to vote, but this is late in the election.
Well, this is late in the early voting scheme, and I appreciate convenience, I do. But 28 days at this cost, this is crazy. And the discussion we had with Daniel Ivy Soto yesterday on my show, who is the former director of the Bureau of Elections, he says, this just doesn't make any sense.
How many people vote more now than they used to? I'm talking about in terms of peoples.
None. It has not improved. And the reason that we have extended this voting period was to improve voter participation, but it hasn't happened.
No, it really hasn't. And again, I think the process is a bit cumbersome given the length of time that everybody has to be involved in it.
So, for those of you listening around the country, I would be interested to know if you have a 28-day voting cycle, or what your voting cycle is. I know it differs clear across the country, but I have to tell you what, in a small state that's a big state like New Mexico, but 28 days is outrageous. And I think Linda Chavez was exactly correct. What you know 28 days out versus what you know 7 days out or 4 days out of an election, two very different sets of knowledge.
And Linda grew up in New Mexico. Most people may not know that, but she did.
The one thing you got to keep in mind, though, here is the ballot is pretty long this year. And I would say the average person that I have watched at the poll has taken between 15 and in some cases as long as 30 minutes to fill out their ballot. So especially if they do all the judges and constitutional amendments, bonds, and things of that nature, it takes a good element of time to prepare yourself to vote things.
Even if you studied it ahead of time and go in, it still takes a lot of time to go through it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, what is the consensus here? Shorten this time? If I were going back to the legislature, that is exactly the kind of bill I would be putting in, because It just doesn't make sense. $5 million for a primary election, $5 million for the general election, please.
With the state that the finance is in the state, and the condition that it's going to be, I think that they need to look at this as one of the cost-cutting methods that would be able to cut it down, because you have to pay people that normally don't work to come in and do those jobs, and right now is not the time to increase cost.
I would agree. I'd also suggest that they limit the